Well, what do we need to know about the home buying process in a difficult market? Today we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. Good afternoon. This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thanks so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Well, how do you go about buying a house in a difficult market? Today, mortgage consultant Mark Pfeiffer is going to answer questions that, well, listeners want to know. Well, Mark, I always want to start off with a look at the real estate markets. Has there been any changes or maybe a spark of hope since we talked last time? And a lot has happened, of course, since we talked last time. But all this would mean, how are interest rates holding up? Obviously, we'd love to see them go down.
Yeah, you and I call it 30 days ago when we last did this, and the month of March was not good for us. The rates went up, call it about a half a point, believe it or not, and it's all because of what's going on in the Middle East. Bombs start flying, nerves start hitting the markets, and all of a sudden oil goes up to $110 a barrel, and all of that is signifying potential inflation. And inflation is the number one enemy of what we do in the mortgage world, right? Because somebody's going to borrow money for 30 years. Inflation eats into those profits for a lender. So rates have gone up. So it's not been ideal. But the good news is, a little optimism here, the market's at least been good. Like, people are still out getting pre-qualified. The spring season's here, and we got a lot of people out looking. So I think despite higher rates, we're still seeing a lot of good activity that shows things are getting better.
It's really interesting because we went through this. I'm not in the real estate business.
Join me, Bob.
But we went through this situation with, I think, we're just kind of watching from afar, to where prices went up all of a sudden, and it was like things looked like they were given the best try, and then it's just kind of slumped off, but it really hasn't moved at all. It's kind of like that. Everybody in the real estate business is trying to push it, if is the best way I can put it.
Yeah, you can argue that, folks like me are trying to give the glass half full, like, hey, you should get out there and buy a home. And it's what I've said always, before, pre-COVID, during COVID, after COVID, buy a house when you're ready. Yes, it is a financial decision, and that it obviously can bode well. And there are rare instances where it doesn't work for some. But the reality is the market's still really good. And to your point, it hasn't done a lot in the last year, which I think is good.
Absolutely stable.
Stable. I'll take stable, right? Because it's wild. When rates are up, they're down, they're up, they're down. Prices are up, they're down. It just creates a lot of that uncertainty. But we've been relatively boring the last 12 months. I mean, rates have moved a little, like I mentioned, half a point here, but to just rewind, in January and February, rates came down about a quarter to half point.
They're not up 5%.
Exactly. They didn't go from 3 to 8. Yeah, 3 to 8 in 1 year was a big jump. This one, they've moved up and down a little, but it's been relatively steady. And again, predictable's good. Some markets are down 1 to 3%. Others, like here in North Texas, we're up probably 1 to 3%. So nothing big, but we'll take steady. Sure. We'll take even.
So tell me, Mark, what is your forecast on home builders? It didn't take long for them to, it seemed like, raise prices on some of their inventory. Given any move of prices to the upside, do you think that you're going to see, a real big increase on some of this inventory?
They're kind of playing the market like we are, in the sense they're taking it day by day. It's amazing how fast builders will turn on and turn off. And that's relatively speaking, right? There's still a long process for them to get dirt ready, put in roads, all that stuff for the developers. But the home builders themselves, they're very quick to pull back their starts. They're very in tune with what rates are doing. But I would say overall, again, it's kind of like what we just talked about. It's relatively flat. Here's what I did see, an interesting article yesterday. Japanese, like the Japan, like the country of Japan, whoever it is, a lot of the Japanese investors are buying home builders to the point that in the last 5 years, 23 home builders in the United States have been purchased by Japanese companies. And like one of the home builders, for example, builds 5,000 homes a year. So much so that apparently they're going to own about 6% of the market, which is a big number from a foreign investor. So to me, somebody doesn't put in multi-billions of dollars with the expectation that things are going to go down. So I do think the home builders right now are kind of like the rest of us, just waiting to see what happens this year and next. And With the rates being steady, they've kind of just been steady. We're not, they're not blowing the doors off anything, but I think everybody's being prudent and building to the demand that's out there.
This is going to sound maybe like a Captain Obvious question, but I think it's a legit question. Is it a buyer's market or a seller's market right now?
That's a good question. I would say overall, you could argue that it would be a buyer's market, especially with new construction. Builders have to sell homes to stay in business. Joe homeowner, if the price isn't right and it doesn't make sense, they may not move or they can wait another year. Home builders have to sell these homes, right? This is how they stay in business. So in that instance, it's a lot of the buyer's market, but I have seen numbers that just show that inventory is coming down. And it depends on where you're buying and,
right.
Certain neighborhoods, certain cities. But overall, I'd say it's a relatively stable market, but with a slight edge to the buyers right now.
Yeah. Are you still seeing a difference? When you talk about the Dallas-Fort Worth market, I mean, totally, can't stress this enough, totally different market than maybe, other big cities. Are we seeing that as an advantage? I mean, how are things going in California or any other states right now?
Yeah, I think North Texas in general is doing great. Austin's been hit the hardest,
Yes.
and it's down 3 to 6%. So let's just put that. I mean, it's literally number one in the country of being hit, and values are down 3 to 6%. So this isn't like a massive drop. But I'll tell you, like the Northeast, Pacific, for whatever reason, the Northeast, New England area. Man, it is a seller's market still. Like their inventory is still so constrained. So to say we're in Dallas-Fort Worth and have the land to build, the area to expand, the fact that it is slightly, edged to the buyers here, I think is a great thing for us. It keeps prices relatively stable, right? It makes it to where things are affordable. It's all relative, but affordable compared to other parts of the country. So I'd say still very blessed and still very lucky to be here in North Texas.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. I do appreciate it. It's Mortgage Mark, him, the one, the only, here in the studio with me. And if you want more information, mortgagemark.com is where you would go. Let's talk a little bit about the underwriting process, which may or may not be a little bit different in a market like this. It is a question I do have for you. Do the underwriters and companies look at things maybe a little bit different?
What's interesting is the market itself will certainly drive some of that to say, bigger volume, it just means more bad guys. Like fraud's always a big concern for mortgage companies in general. A lot of it's occupancy fraud, meaning somebody says they're going to live there and then ultimately they bought it as an investment property. And that's a big no-no. That's the F word in the mortgage industry.
Okay, right.
So the more volume that happens, the more you're going to see, fraud. But in this market, as things slow down, there are those investors that are trying to get sneaky, that are saying they're going to live there to get the better rates, to get the better down payment options. And so we have seen fraud on the rise. So it does make underwriting a little more, meticulous at what they're looking for, and a few more questions get asked if something's in the gray. So underwriting has changed in the last year or two for that reason. And you can argue that it's somewhat due to the market. With higher rates, investors are going to try to do what they can to try to squeeze out a few bucks.
Sure.
Not that I don't advocate it. Don't do that. Fraud is bad.
Which means not true answers on the app.
100%. And we call it FIG, right? The Fraud Investigation Group. FIG has gotten more in our world recently. And a lot of times it
So
truly
you
is
see a
innocent.
lot of enforcement?
We see a lot of questions. So they reach out and they say, hey, we've done homework. And they do homework on me, anybody on the team, anybody in the file, they'll do homework. So underwriting, again, whether it's FIG coming in or underwriters saying, hey, we want a second look, there has been a lot more of that in the last probably 12 months. And I think a lot of that's just due to the market conditions and folks trying to make things work.
So have you seen deals that are pre-approvals, the couple feel like they're set to go, and some regulator comes in and says, not so sure about it.
I had a guy that was moving from Jersey, and FIG got involved. They told me what's going on, and I did not let him know what, there are certain things I'm allowed to say and not say. And same for them. There's only so much they can tell us. And ultimately, I just had to tell the guy, like, look, based on what we know, things that have been disclosed, we can't help you do it under this occupancy. And he ultimately went somewhere else, to my knowledge, because it was with I understand the third party that was involved in the transaction. They did buy it as owner occupied, and literally, Bob, just yesterday, this is just a fresh story, we looked it up and the home is for rent. but yet they bought it as owner occupied. So again, our department caught it. Stinks for the Mortgage Mark team because we get paid to close loans. But the reality is Fig was right, and some other lender out there didn't do their homework, and they closed a loan that now is probably misrepresented.
So how do you compare that to what happened in '08? I mean, there was a lot. Well, I think they called them liar loans, right?
Oh, yeah. So '08 was interesting because the guidelines permitted this. I mean, the difference here is this guy in this example, and we'll say allegedly. I'm not the judge or the jury. So this guy, this alleged person did something they weren't supposed to do that's against guidelines. In '07, '08, the guidelines allowed this. There was no income, no assets, ninja loans, right? Anybody can get the loan and not have to disclose anything. And the industry they didn't just allow it, they encouraged it. Programs were out there and all these things. So that is what's different between today. Today's loans that are fraudulent are fraud. Back then, they at least allowed or turned a blind eye based on the guidelines. And like I said, almost to some degree encourage that to happen. So it is a different environment. Still, bad guys always exist, bad guys and gals, and it happens, but not as prevalent as it was in '08 because, again, that's what we as an industry didn't do our jobs back then.
Yeah, I would think that the entire process, every process changed pretty drastically after they said, wow, look what we just went through and still going to be going through for a little bit.
I'll give you this, and this is an example of just how much costs have increased to do a loan. Everything's increased, right? The cost of inflation, et cetera, et cetera. But for us in our industry, compliance has been a huge part of that cost, right? Sure. Now you need a FIG department. Whereas you may not have had that before. The fraud investigation department, that's extra humans. You got to pay for that. The credit, for example, credit reports used to be, call it $20, $30, right? And then all of a sudden today, you can pay $400 to $500 on a closing for credit verifications, verifying where they work, verifying their mortgage, verifying, X, Y, and Z from the IRS. Like all these verifications now exist to get third parties to confirm what the buyer has already told us.
Okay, so this once again sets up the situation. You could be pre-approved, pick the house out, and then they come right in behind you and they go, "We don't like that answer. Let's check it out."
And again, understand that if you're a normal good person, which I would say the vast majority of people are, it may be an inconvenience. It won't be, "Hey, your loan's denied." It'll be, "Hey, we have questions. Let's address these questions and show me documentation. I want further evidence of what you're presenting." So that certainly has become more common. But the bad guys now, they could be pre-approved. They can go through, and here's the real issue. And this isn't self-promoting. It'll sound that way to some degree, but work with a lender who knows what they're doing, who asks good questions, has good listening ears, because the majority of the time, if there's problems for loans, not ours, but I see this in the industry, when people come to us, it's not that somebody was trying to do something wrong. They just didn't have the right discussion up front.
I can see that.
It's just they didn't have the right questions, the right answers, and they just didn't set it up correctly. It's not that anybody was trying to do anything wrong. They just didn't know. And there is a difference between ignorance and malintent.
Well, let's get rid of some of that ignorance today. Talk a little bit about underwriters, what they're looking for. What do you think are the top three elements of their underwriters looking for in writing a mortgage?
Yeah, good question. So think of it like a stool, right? You got three legs to the stool. It's credit, income, and assets. I mean, credit's going to be the obvious. Like, do you pay your bills on time? How much debt? What's the liabilities are out there? Income. Is the job, is it stable? Is it predictable? Is it, increasing, decreasing? And then assets. How much money do you have in the bank? You get this new home. If something happens in life, which often it does, do you have enough in reserves and to be able to afford the mortgage payment should something happen? So it's those three, credit, income, and assets, that kind of make up the overlying projection. And not all three have to be perfect, but you'd like to have 2 out of 3 be pretty strong if you're going to get that loan.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show, talking to Mark Pfeiffer today. If you want any information on Mark, you go to Mortgage Mark. So, Mark, I've always been under the understanding that the income to debt ratio, I guess I'm saying that right, or debt to income, is very important, and very important that people understand how it works. Talk a little bit about how this works, what the underwriters are really looking for to see if that ratio, which I think you said before is between 45 and 50%, And what exactly are they looking for?
Yeah, good question. And you're 100% right. So DTI, debt to income, that is when somebody says, how much home can I buy or what can I afford? That DTI is typically the driving force. So what is it? It's your debts. And for debts in the mortgage world, we're talking, your future soon to be mortgage payment, whatever you're about to get, and existing mortgage payments, credit card minimum payments, not the full, but the minimum payments, and car loans and student loans. Anything that's going to show up on a credit report. What it does not include is like your utility bills and cable bills and cell phone bills, things like that. But a credit report, credit cards, student loans, obligations from a divorce decree, you add up all those monthly debt obligations. So let's just use a number for easy math here. We're going to say, let's say the new mortgage, a car loan, and some credit card debt totals $4,000 a month. Now they're going to look at your income. So the debt to income. So debt goes on top. And income, they're going to look at, and this is what's interesting, it's the gross income. This now goes into your bank account.
I've heard that.
It's the gross income, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me because
it really doesn't make a lot of sense.
The government's going to take whatever they're going to take for taxes. But at the end of the day, we do use the gross. And so if somebody, let's say the household income's $10,000 a month, in our example here, you take the $4,000 they're about to pay, new mortgage, all that stuff, divided by the $10,000 that they get in gross income per month, and it's a 40% DTI. And you're right, a lot of programs, some will have hard stops at 43, many will say 45. There are some that will go to 50. In rare cases, it can be where DTI can go 50 to 60. And you would think, why would somebody give a loan for somebody with a 55, 60% of their gross income going out the door to debts? And a lot of times those are examples where maybe we're not using the spouse. Maybe their credit's not up to snuff. And so it's they have income that we can't count or we're not counting. So there are compensating factors when things go that high. We're trying to be responsible as an industry. But in general, the DTI is very important. And about that 45-ish is a really good metric to kind of think about and work towards.
Now, I would assume that you would include IRS debt.
IRS debt is absolutely correct.
That was really interesting to me because a friend of mine had unbelievable problems with the IRS and somehow walked away with $1 million mortgage. I still can't figure that out. I've asked him 1,000 times.
Here's the deal. If you're making payments, if you have a payment plan set up with the IRS, it's no different than it's actually different that they're going to get their money. But
Yes,
it's no different in that if there's a car loan for $1,000 or an IRS debt for $1,000, it's the same $1,000. So as long as somebody can afford that payment going out the door, they can still get a mortgage.
So let's talk a little bit about, you're between that 45 to 50. You go over that 50 for the standard mortgage that y'all always write. How many, and you may not know this off the top of your head, but how many different programs could you say, okay, that one didn't work. We're going to go out and this is where I think the good mortgage consultants really earn their money. They find a solution. And how many programs are you looking at?
So the big buckets, there's usually about 4 or 5 main buckets where mortgage programs fall under. So the conforming conventional loans like the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, right? So that's kind of the big bucket. That's the normal. Then you got your government loans like FHA, VA, USDA. And then you got your non-conventional stuff like maybe jumbos or your non-QM type products. So to answer your question, I'd say about, especially the government loans, they are absolutely more lenient to allow for those higher debt ratios. Jumbo loans typically are 43%, pretty hard and fast. USDA's 43%, a lot of times maybe can go up a little more. So to answer your question, you typically see the 45 to 50 with some of the Fannie Mae stuff, the normal plain vanilla, and with FHA and VA. So, I don't want to say half, but a lot of them can and will allow those higher DTI limits. It just, again, there's got to be other compensating factors if you're going to start pushing that threshold above 45.
And then the jumbo loan line in the sand, what is that?
So in today's market, depends on where you are, what state, things like that. But for easy round math or round numbers, if you're getting a loan, call it north of 800, you're going to be right there in that jumbo world. So it's amazing. When you and I first started getting to know each other, 15, 20 years ago, it was 417,000.
Yeah.
Now it's
I remember that. Yeah.
Now we're sitting in that 800 plus range.
Yeah, it's going the wrong way, right?
It's crazy how that's just quote normal these days. So it is something to pay attention to. But in today's world, the jumbo rates are relatively comparable?
Well, it would seem to me, tell me if this is right or wrong, it would seem like back 15, 20 years ago, that was the exotic loan. They had to do things differently with that loan. It took them a lot longer. So they probably, compared to now, now when $800,000 is the standard, you can go up to that and get all the advantages of a jumbo loan that you couldn't get, and you had to take more time. So it's just interesting it's changed so much.
It is. And nowadays, the jumbo loans, like I said, are relatively right as far as risk, how the market assesses them. The rates are relatively comparable. But you can see in some instances, like post the meltdown, there was a massive gap between normal and jumbo. And the underwriting, to your point, was so much more critical. And I'm not saying that's not the case today, but it is interesting how it's just become more commonplace, right? Because houses are more expensive, and doing $1 million, $1.5 million loan is no longer that big a deal. I got folks that are buying their first home that's $1.2 million. Like, think about that. Like, I bought my first home, it was $100,000.
That's right.
So kids these days, whether it's help from parents or just waiting longer, the average age for the first time home buyer, I've seen stats say north of 40 now, which is crazy.
That is. I would not have thought that high.
And again, it's not every stat, but I would say it's certainly mid 30s. That's the low side of it. So it's the first time home buyers now just later. And then also with the generational wealth that's coming to be with the baby boomers, a lot of folks are buying their first home at $600,000, $800,000 or $1 million. And suddenly, to your point, it's just different today.
Let's talk a little bit as we wrap things up. What happened with Oracle. I don't know if you heard about this or not. They did a round of layoffs. They're estimating up to 30,000 employees, which is just awful. In a situation like that, you're right in the middle of buying a house. I would just assume everything comes crashing down at that point.
You're not wrong, right? So income, like we talked about earlier in the program, income, assets, and credit. If the income suddenly disappears, it depends on how fast can that person pivot. Maybe there's somebody else in the household. As long as the household income, if somebody loses their job midway through, if the other person, if there are two on the loan, if the other person is capable of carrying the mortgage, no harm, no foul. But obviously, if you get laid off or there's a pending end to the employment, even if it's 6 months from now, that's not going to be income you can qualify with. So it does put a pretty hard stop to things if layoffs happen in mid-process.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the process. Someone comes to see you, they start the process, and I'm assuming the gold standard is to get pre-approval, because there was another approval type that's a little bit, it says we probably can.
Yeah, pre-qualified and pre-approved are two different things, right? So pre-qualified says you tell me you make $1 million a month. Pre-approved says you've proven that number is real, right? So you can tell me whatever you want and get pre-qualified. Pre-approval says there's documentation behind it.
Right. So how long does that process take on an average?
Yeah, I'd say in general, industry, ours included, right? I would say that you give us the information, within a few business hours, you can get pre-qualified. If you give us the documentation, call it a day or two just to make sure you give us enough time to look through it and make sure we've asked questions and do the follow-up. So to get pre-approved, I'd say within 24 hours is pretty standard for the industry. To get pre-approved, which I do highly recommend, it can take 2 or 3 days, just depending on just to what work and how many documents are to review.
Right, which there could be, if you're smart, you're sending everything.
I got one guy that has 97 LLCs. So it's that took us about a week to go through, right? But for somebody who's a W-2 normal plain vanilla person, man, that's an hour or two, right? It's a matter of just finding that quiet time through the day to be able to go through and just validate all the information and pre-underwrite that file and get that pre-approval done.
Well, great info, Mark. And once again, if you want more information on Mark, go to www.mortgagemark.com. Mark, we'll see you next month.
Thanks for having me, Bob.
This is Bob Brooks. If you got a question for me, please go to the website at www.prudentmoney.com and send it in, because we are all out of time. We do meet again next time. Keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.